My pleasure to welcome Ken Timmerman, who's a war correspondent and best-selling author. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, let me just share with people a book that you wrote, I believe, 2 years ago. Let me just share this. And the rest is history, tales of hostages, arms dealers, dirty tricks, and spies. And it's a real-life adventure story told by a New York Times bestselling author, war correspondent, reveals how he became a hostage, an arms dealer, and an Israeli spy. That is quite a catchy subtitle there. I mean, you've had an amazing life, and I do want to get back to your book and your life, but before we get into that, I do want to ask you about what's going on in the Middle East, and particularly you wrote a book article for Front Page Magazine about Hamas's child hostages. So let's talk about that first. What is your perspective on what's going on in the war between Israel and Hamas? And
Sure.
some people are saying, oh, we should have a two-state solution. I'm just curious what your opinion is about that concept.
Well, I've been going back and forth to Israel, to the West Bank, Beirut, Lebanon, in places in the region for the past 40 years. So this is, I had the opportunity to go there at the end of November, beginning December, during a truce when there was a hostage exchange taking place. And what really struck me was the completely different mood in Israel from what I have seen in the past. I've been there after peace agreements were announced. For example, after the Oslo Accords were announced, I was there on the presidential trip with Bill Clinton in '94. When he went to Israel, he went to Jordan to sign a peace agreement with Jordan. And there was a certain amount of elation in Israel, a belief that, peace really was at hand. It was possible to make an agreement with their neighbors, not just the Jordanians, but also with the Palestinians. And remember, in '94, that's when Arafat installed himself in Gaza, and the Palestinian Authority was born. And yet, within 5 years, 6 years, that devolved. And by the year 2000, you had the homicide bombers who were blowing themselves up at Israeli bus stops and cafes. There's one I particularly went to report on in a book I wrote at the time called Preachers of Hate, Islam and the War in America, which came out in 2002. And that was at the Park Park Hotel in Netanya, when a Palestinian dressed as a woman came into a cellar, into a Passover dinner, and killed something like 60 people, including a Holocaust survivor. So each time you've had these peace agreements announced, there's been an elation, and people said, okay, yeah, we can do it. It's going to happen. We're going to have a peace with the Palestinians. And then, of course, Oslo turned into the Oslo fence, where they had to build a wall, and they called it the Oslo fence. This time, when I was there, November, December, it was very different. There was no sense that there could be a peace agreement at the end of this war. The Hamas murderers who came into Israel on October 7th, they came in there with an explicit genocidal intent, explicit genocidal intent. And it's something that the Israelis hadn't seen before, hadn't seen really since World War II.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, from what you're saying, Israel was ready to sign a peace treaty, an agreement with, I guess, Mr. Arafat, the PLO, and to have recognize each other, have peaceful relationships between, I guess, a Palestinian state of some kind and Israel. Why would, if that's the desire of Israelis, and if that's the desire of Palestinians, why would the PLO reject the peace agreement at Oslo agreement, and why would they send suicide bombers into Israel the next day? Or, I mean, well, why? Break that down for us.
So Arafat explained this very well in speeches to his own people in Arabic. In English, he was saying, we want peace with Israel. And in Arabic, he said, this is a Hudaybiyah. He referred to a passage in the Quran where, in the Hadith, where it talks about Muhammad declaring a truce with the Bani Hashim, the Bani Quraysh in Mecca for 10 years. This was the Jewish tribes in Mecca, until he became powerful enough to be able to destroy them and to enslave them. So Arafat referred to Oslo as a Hudaybiyah, in other words, a temporary truce. And to put a fine line on that, you just never had a Palestinian partner who really wanted peace. The Israelis continued to make efforts. They offered a yet another peace agreement, another Palestinian state, like the fourth time or fifth time it was in 2000 to Arafat. He came to Wye River in the United States with Clinton and Ehud Barak, who was the prime minister then. They were going to give him Jerusalem as his capital and all of the West Bank and Gaza. And he said no, he couldn't do it. And that's when he unleashed the second intifada. The Palestinians do not want a Palestinian state. They want Israel, and they want all of Israel, and they want no Jews left in Israel. And that is what Hamas told us on October 7th. They made it very, very clear. And this time the Israelis finally got it. They finally understood they have no negotiating partner. There's not going to be a peace agreement possible with Palestinians until that generation dies out. It's a little bit like the Bible when the Israelites left Egypt, and
Right.
God said to Moses, this generation has to die out before you can come to the promised land. The problem is that the generation we're talking about, they are now 3 years old, 5 years old, 8 years old. They had been brainwashed in these UNRWA schools, these United Nations schools,
Right.
to hate Jews, to want to exterminate Jews, and to obliterate the state of Israel. That's the generation that has to die out. So this is a generational war. It's not going to be over until that generation dies out, and new generations have been raised up in a culture of peace and coexistence, which is not in the cards, by the way. The Palestinians don't want it.
I mean, it's really hard for Americans to understand. I mean, the average American says, what do you mean they don't want peace? I mean, it literally makes no sense to say 95% of Americans, we just can't get it. Why? What is more important to the Palestinians than allowing their children to grow up and be prosperous and not have to die? Or can you explain to us what is more important to them than having prosperity for their families?
You see, many Jews believe this as well, including very good friends of mine in the security establishment, and they felt that all they had to do was give another 10,000 work permits to Palestinians in Gaza. Just let them be prosperous, let them make more money, bring it home to their families, and everything will be fine. In fact, they made a new agreement, a new ceasefire with Hamas just a week before October 7th. That's the supreme irony here. And Hamas said, no, these are just tricks. We're playing tricks on you. We raise our children to become shaheed, to become martyrs, to die. We raise them to die killing Jews. There's a horrible video that the Israelis found on a cell phone of one of the Hamas terrorists on October 7th, where this young man, he's 18 or 19 years old. He's calling home to his parents in Gaza, and he says, Mama, Baba, oh, today it is glorious. I just killed a Jew with my own hands.
Right. Right.
This was the best thing that he could possibly imagine. And he died, shortly afterwards. And to his mind and in the mind of his parents, he was glorified by Allah. So this is the problem. They do not have the same values. They do not share the values that we do. They do not want the same things for their children that we do. And until those generations die out, there cannot be any peace, and certainly not any hope of a Palestinian state.
Okay, you've just slapped 95% of people in the face with the. Now, some people are critical of Israel, and they say that Israel is too harsh, and that there are excessive number of civilians being killed in Gaza. What is your perspective on how the Israeli Defense Force is operating in Gaza? What would your perspective be?
Look, the Israelis take more care in preserving civilian life than the United States does. I hate to tell you that. We have killed more people with our drone attacks under Obama in particular, more civilians, people who had nothing to do with terror attacks except to be in the same family with a terrorist, than the Israelis do. They've lost many, many young soldiers, men and women, by going in on the ground, in the streets, walking into blind alleys, tripping booby traps. There was one event not too long ago, a week or 2 weeks ago, they lost 20 soldiers in one of these ambushes with and they do that instead of what everybody's accusing them of, indiscriminate bombing. They do not carry out indiscriminate bombing. And I challenge anybody who thinks that to seriously look at any of the videos that the IDF has posted of bomb camera footage where they're showing the actual bombs going down. The Israelis are using smaller bombs than we do, and they're using smaller bombs than we do so they will not blow down buildings next to the ones that they're attacking. And you look at those bombings, and you'll see the bomb comes right down here. It hits the people who are there on the ground. And afterwards, when the smoke clears, the buildings next door are still there, still intact. Okay, it's not this gigantic crater. It is certainly not indiscriminate. That is the most discriminate bombing imaginable.
Now, is it true that Hamas uses women and children as human shields? Are they putting their rocket launchers in playgrounds, schools, mosques? I mean, what are those? What are their tactics?
This is what Hamas does, and you don't have to ask me. Ask Bassam Aid, who's a Palestinian human rights activist, who said famously 2 years ago, before this current round of fighting, he says Israel uses its rockets, its Iron Dome, as a shield to its civilians. Hamas uses its civilians as a shield to its rockets. So they purposefully place the rocket launchers in civilian areas. They purposefully place their weapons depots in schools and in mosques. They purposefully build tunnels connecting schools and mosques and military headquarters. So when the Israelis do finally attack them, they can say, oh, the Israelis are attacking schools and mosques. Isn't this terrible? In fact, the Israelis are targeting areas where they have seen Hamas fighters basing themselves or using them as attack points.
Now, I've read that Hamas has built 350 miles of tunnels. What are those tunnels? Is that true? And what are those tunnels for?
Well, that was the estimate the Israelis had before they went in. Now it's well over 500, 600 miles of tunnels. It's way more than what they had estimated before. And the tunnels are for a number of different things. They use them, for example, to bring fighters from the north to the south of Gaza when the Israelis are someplace in between, so they can move them around on the battlefield. They use them, and they have larger tunnels, such as the ones that I write about in my book, And the Rest is History, that I saw in Beirut in 1982 and 1983. They have tunnels large enough to actually put rocket launchers inside. They can drive them inside. So they will go outside and shoot, and then they will back them into the tunnels to hide them from the Israeli Air Force afterwards. And these are concrete reinforced tunnels. They use them also as weapons depots, and they use them as weapons manufacturing workshops. They have underground rocket manufacturing workshops in these tunnels.
Some people are critical of the Israeli blockade of Gaza. I mean, I'm getting, not just now, but for many years now, right? why has Israel been blocking, surrounding Gaza, the Gaza Strip? Can you explain why were they, I guess, preventing the entrance of what, building materials or certain materials to go into Gaza?
Well, the Israelis have found that all of those building materials, that cement, they were not being used for civilian buildings. They were being used to build tunnels, to build that tunnel infrastructure. And actually, there's a lot of Israelis today who are extremely critical of the Israeli government for agreeing to the so-called humanitarian ceasefires, where they will allow trucks to go into Gaza, bringing food and water and other supplies to Palestinian civilians, because they know that Hamas is hijacking all of these supplies, and they protest the government and they say, you are just prolonging the war. You're helping Hamas by supplying them. Now, the government says, okay, we have to do this. There are humanitarian causes here, and we know that Hamas is hijacking this, but we have to do it nevertheless, because we hold ourselves to a higher standard. We will not go out of our way to attack the civilian population. We are going out of our way to separate the civilian population from the fighters.
Many people are concerned about an expanded war in the Middle East, even, a World War III. And they're concerned about provoking Iran. What is your perspective? No sane person wants to have a world war, obviously, but I mean, it seems to me that maybe there's already a world war going on that's not hot all over. What is your perspective?
Well, the Iranians have been attacking us in Syria. They've been attacking us in Iraq, most recently in Jordan, where they killed 3 soldiers. They've been doing this since the beginning of the Gaza war and before, but they've been intensifying those attacks since the Gaza war. There have been over 160, 170 of those attacks so far, and that's not counting the attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. That has really shut down the Red Sea and the Suez Canal and driven up the price of container traffic from the Far East to Europe, tripled the cost of bringing a container from the Far East to Europe. This threat of the wider war, the White House talks about it all the time. The Pentagon mentions it, but it kind of reminds me of kids in a playground in high school, and the kids are getting beaten up by a bully, and the counselor says, "Well, you don't want to strike back at that bully because he might hit you again. Don't strike that bully. He might hit you again." And of course, the bully hits you again. And the counselor says, no, don't hit the bully. He might get a friend, and then the friend and the bully will hit you again. Well, the Iranians are the bully. And we are not hitting them back. And we are certainly not deterring them. When we do hit them, we are not deterring them from striking again. And I happen to believe, and I've written a paper for the America First Policy Institute about the Gaza war and the end of the 2-state solution. I happen to believe that we need to deter Iran in a very forceful way to prevent a wider war. Right now, our policies of weakness are actually encouraging the Iranians to attack us. And so we need to hit them hard, the way President Trump did in January of 2020, when he took out the head of the Quds Force, their top terrorist, Qasem Soleimani, in Baghdad. We need to hit them hard, hit something that they really care about. I have a saying, I've been working with the Iranians and Iranian freedom fighters for many, many years. I run something called the Foundation for Democracy in Iran. It's iran.org. And I like to say that the Iranian regime will fight Israel to the blood of the last Palestinian. They will fight Israel to the blood of the last Lebanese. But they will not fight America to the blood of the last Iranian. They will try to get other people to do their fighting. So we have to make the Iranian regime pay a price that they care about if we want to stop these attacks.
Okay. So Okay, so peace through strength is essentially the philosophy that the weakness invites them to be more aggressive. That's what you're saying?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, and it's a horrific situation. It's just heartbreaking to see these children who were kidnapped and murdered and the women raped. The whole thing is like a horror movie. Um,
There are
I'd
things
like
when
to
you
ask you
see
about,
them, when
huh?
you see those things, you
Yeah.
cannot unsee them. And I do not recommend that our audience go out and watch those videos because they are truly horrifying. They are truly horrifying.
Yeah, I saw one video of there was I guess a correspondent who was traveling along a road in Gaza, and there were all these dead bodies of Gaza residents who had been trying to escape to the south, and they had all been shot uh, by Hamas for wanting to escape. And yeah, it was. Well, okay, let's think about. I'd like to ask you a little bit about your life. If you don't mind, how did you go from being a left bank leftist to a born again Christian conservative?
Well, I was living. So the first time I go to the Middle East is 1982. As a young reporter, I was a stringer for a radio station, and I had many students at that time, Lebanese students, who were encouraging me to go to Lebanon during that war. That was the what's now called the First Israel-Lebanese War of 1982. And I went there supporting the Palestinians. I was living in Paris and being brainwashed by the French news media, the American news media, which was invariably pro-Palestinian and anti-Israeli. And I had support from various Palestinian ambassadors, and I'd met with them in Paris and stopped on my way in Athens and met with the ambassador there. So I thought I was going there as a friend of the Palestinians. I was going to report like Ernest Hemingway from inside the battle zone and write all these stories about what it was like to be the poor Palestinian David against the Israeli Goliath. And as soon as I got there, I was promptly taken hostage by those Palestinians who I was going to report on and held for 24 days in an underground cell. And we were right on the front lines where the Palestinians had those tunnels that we mentioned earlier. And in the tunnels, they had their AAA artillery, their anti-aircraft artillery. So they would be firing at the Israeli jets as they were coming in and then scooting into the tunnels. And the Israeli jets would then either fire rockets or bombs on the places where they were coming from. Well, I was underneath. I was underneath. And I can remember after the war at a briefing at the IDF with the IDF in Jerusalem a couple of months later, where correspondents were saying, as you had mentioned earlier, oh, this indiscriminate bombing that you've been doing, the Israelis, it's terrible. And the colonel at that time, he said he pulled out a photograph, a bomb camera photograph, and showing the sports stadium in Beirut. And he said, "Look, this is where we were bombing. You can see all the craters of our bombs here within a 100-meter radius of where they had their air defense positions." And I said, "Colonel," I raised my hand and said, "Colonel, I can attest to that because I was underneath." I was underneath there. And the building I was held in, it had 8 stories when I went in the middle of July. And 3.5 weeks later, when I got out, it was 1.5 stories and pancakes. And I got out by the grace of God. Only by the grace of God. People ask me, there was no other way. We were all going to die like rats. And I learned when I was there in the darkness, being bombed, and they were taking people out and shooting them in the alleyway. I understood that I had a Savior who was there next to me at all moments, watching over me and guiding me and protecting me. And that was something that has never left me, and it completely changed my life. I was brought up a Christian, but like many young people, I was 28. I had fallen away from the faith. and was no longer really actively practicing my Christian faith. And I rediscovered it very quickly in a very personal and a very visceral way. Jesus was there with me in that cell, and I felt his presence in a very, very personal manner. And I've felt that since then as well. And I understand that he is really a part of me, a part of us. And all you have to do is say yes. All you have to do is say yes. Then he's there.
Wow. Well, you've had an amazing life, I have to say, and I do want everyone to check out your book. Let me just share that, and then Front Page Mag. What is tell us a little bit about frontpagemag.com. What is that about?
That's a conservative website run by David Horowitz. You can see up at the top, David Horowitz is mentioned. He says, inside every progressive is a totalitarian screaming to get out. David is really one of the icons of the conservative movement in the United States. He started out, as I did, on the left, but even further to the left than I was. And he saw the light and he turned around. And now he denounces the left, and he denounces the totalitarian vision and actions of the hard left in the United States, their efforts to take over our schools, their efforts to pollute our children, to control our minds, to control social media. And he's been very, very effective at that. So this is a daily website with news and opinion columns, which are among the best on the internet, I think.
All right, and let me show your book again one more time, and the rest is history, and it looks pretty dramatic. I'll just put it that way.
Well, war stories and real life stories. And when I say, how I became a hostage and arms dealer and an Israeli spy, that's true, literally true. And I tell those stories in the book. And you'll see there's a foreword there by Rabbi Abraham Cooper of the Simon Wiesenthal Center. I worked quite a bit during my earlier years with Simon Wiesenthal, the Nazi hunter, in Europe, and then with the center in Los Angeles. So I tell a couple of those stories as well. We were going after Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction, trying to expose them, exposing the Iranian regime's nuclear weapons programs early on before people realized how serious they were. And again, it's also a personal journey. It is this personal journey of how I went from that left bank intellectual to become a born-again Christian Zionist.
Yeah, there's a great quote here from Simon Wiesenthal. I have spent my life tracking the murders of yesterday. Mr. Timmerman is tracking the murderers of tomorrow. That's quite a quote there. Yeah, you mentioned about the weapons of mass destruction. Were there weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? I'm just curious.
Well, a lot of things get down to definitions. If you mean during the first Gulf War, absolutely. And I don't think that's disputed. But people wonder about the second Gulf War, 2003, 2004. And I would argue that, yes, there were. When you define weapons of mass destruction as was normally defined at the time, meaning the materials, the programs, the know-how to make weapons of mass destruction. We did not find the stockpiles of chemical weapons, for example, that Colin Powell told us would be there. But one of the reasons we didn't find the stockpiles was because the Iraqis didn't keep stockpiles. They used what are called binary chemical weapons. So they would have inert chemicals that themselves were not chemical weapons. When they combined together in the shell at the explosion of the artillery shell, they would make sarin gas or tavon gas or some other form of chemical weapon. So we did not find the weaponized gas because it deteriorates rapidly. We found hundreds of tons of these precursor chemicals, that's what they're called, that combine together make chemical weapons. In 2007, just to give you another example, people said he had no nuclear weapons program when we went in. Well, in 2007, the new Iraqi government made a deal with the government of Canada to export 1,000 tons of uranium yellowcake. I guarantee you they had not found that. They were not using that to make smoke detectors, nor was Saddam Hussein. So he had 1,000 tons of uranium yellowcake, which nobody had found up until, after the second Gulf War. And when the weapons inspectors found it and talked about it, the media said, no, 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 no. Bush lied, people died, no weapons of mass destruction.
Okay, there you have it, everyone. We have Mr. Timmerman, who's been reporting on the Middle East for many, many decades. Thank you for coming on the show. We really appreciate you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. God bless.